First off, sorry. My most humbling, sincere apology I could possibly give that there's not going to be any trailer footage, any footage from the show over this video. We're a little pressed for time right now, but I just had to make a video because House of the Dragon, it came, it went, and it was fucking great. There's a part of me that still can't believe that House of the Dragon is as great as it is. You know, Game of Thrones spin-off, it just sounded wrong after the way that the last season ended. It was like we were bound to get something that was going to be muddled, something that was going to be unconfident in its first season. Or even worse, that it had its bright spots, but you just couldn't see how it was going to come together. We're going to be stuck in this perpetual state of mediocrity with the show, while occasionally having moments of brilliance. That is not the case. But it's worth keeping in mind that House of the Dragon wasn't this immediate slam dunk on all fronts from the very beginning. Many of its most praiseworthy attributes were present at the end of the season, but not there at the beginning. The one thing that was the constant to me was the show's look. Camera movement, cinematography, production design were top-notch from beginning to end. And you get the same sense that you had in Better Call Saul, that because of the parent show's success, we now have an expanded budget and more time to meticulously shoot scenes. You don't have to be as economical, shot, reverse shot with every single moment. And yeah, Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad eventually progressed past that, but in its beginning seasons, you could tell that there wasn't too much creativity being deployed on the cinematography department, and from here, and with Better Call Saul, they hit the ground running. There are so many eye-catching shots to speak of, specifically in episode 10, which is very beautiful, and even if you hate Game of Thrones, you think it's corrupting society's mores and values, you just gotta watch the candles go under the table in episode 10. You'll just renounce everything you've ever said about the series. It's that good. But it's not just the way the show dazzles your eye, it's also the fact that the camera work is so clever and so meticulously thought out. Such as the case with the tracking shot in episode 6. Episode 6 is not an impressive episode. It feels very fillery, but people in retrospect will be talking about that episode many times over because of its opening, that you track Rhaenyra giving birth and then going all the way up the steps to see Queen Alicent. It's remarkable and an achievement of staging that's going to keep the show, that specific episodes, alive. And you get that a lot with people politicking, moving around the room with each other. There's a real keen sense of space here and how to use physical motions, when to use the edit to display what character has power over the other. It's overall just really thoughtful stuff. And I'm almost left speechless with how good Westeros looks, with how real it feels. There are maybe like 6 moments in the show where you can really feel the technical wizardry popping up, discounting the dragon scenes. And even then, you're like, oh, I don't really know how I would shoot that. I guess that's really the only way you can show that type of scale. Whenever there is a chance that the writers, the team, can make House of the Dragon look more like something that occurred in our own history than something that looks like fantasy, man, do they seize that opportunity. And like with the camera work, in some rather unimpressive episodes throughout the season, you have these moments that elevate them, that bring them to a higher quality because you're just so in awe of how TV and how a fantasy world like this can be rendered on the small screen. Now, what wasn't quite there was the character and dialogue quality. In some respects, it's still not quite the level you'd want it to be. And it's worth talking about Game of Thrones here. I know some people don't want to talk about Thrones in relation to this, but not only are the comparisons inevitable, but I think they're helpful in critical evaluation. The thing is, Thrones has this abnormally strong start, even though it's trying to accomplish a lot of what House of the Dragon is trying to accomplish. It just so happens that after the first episode, like, the entire ensemble feels richly detailed, and by the end, there's like 8 characters that either have made an immortal mark on the show if they're dead, or you're just so invested in what's happening next with them. Not quite the case with House of the Dragon, but there are some standouts. King Viserys, you already are having people debate over whether he was a good king or not, a good father or not, what are his moral qualities. And you can tell that he is going to loom large over the rest of this series, and people are going to be done talking about him despite his departure, which is a huge compliment to not only the character, but to Paddy Considine, who really brought the character to life. Rhaenyra could not be more invested in her claim for the throne, super behind her cause. Just goddamn did I not expect to be so passionately behind her team in the battle against the High Towers. Queen Alicent's going to go down as one of the best TV villains of the decade. I can see it being one of the best TV villains of all time if she goes at the rate that she's currently going at. And Aemon, someone who's not quite there, not quite in that top tier of characters, but damn is he making his way up there and seems to be having a really intriguing route as the Dance of the Dragons continues. But then there are the lesser characters, and to me the low point has to be Daemon Targaryen. I was surprised to learn that Martin thinks that Daemon is his favorite Targaryen because he's so lazily characterized in my eyes in comparison to the rest of the characters in the ensemble. Now, Martin describes it that Daemon is this morally gray character, and I get what he's saying there. But to me, the beauty of Game of Thrones is that you really never have had a traditional good and evil. You've never had a traditional black and white. All of these characters are morally, or most of these characters are morally nebulous in their own right. There are so many characters where you can reason out, justify why they take certain actions, and see it from their perspective and like them because of their charisma or other features. There are people who loved Cersei, who loved Tywin, who didn't see them as traditional villains. You have your traditional good guys and bad guys who rarely make a morally corruptible decision, like Ned Stark, or you have the Boltons, who are more traditionally evil. But so many of the characters in Game of Thrones shows that realpolitik idea that everyone's just going for power. And so for Daemon, his character just comes off as wishy-washy, that, bleh, yes, he does want to help his brother, that's the focus on that is actually stronger, but when Daemon's going back and forth, he's making all these drastic maneuvers, especially early on, and then kind of in the last episode, it just feels weak in comparison to these other characters who make complicated decisions, who do have moral gray spots, but all of them make sense, whereas Daemon, you're never quite sure, and it doesn't feel like that's interesting, it just kind of feels like it's been done before. Speaking of been done before, you have Larys Strong, who is just Littlefinger 2.0. At this point, he is way too close to Littlefinger in characterization. He's yet again this background figure, has really nothing to his name, but because he's pulling the strings, he's conniving, he's manipulating everyone at the same time, that's what makes him an important player in the Game of Thrones. But for me, like I said, this is just Littlefinger, not one for one, but way too similar where you don't feel like you're getting anything new. This is something that Thrones has done before, and I think it's a virtue of R.R. Martin writing this and just writing a character who just falls too closely into Littlefinger's mold. And I think you can place some blame at the feet of the actors, because these aren't characters that are so much worse off where inspired performances can't elevate them to another level. There's too many scenes right now where I see these two characters enter and I'm like, oh, I just don't want to see this dialogue scene play out. I'd rather see anything else. Larys Strong's actor can't do as much, but with Matt Smith, I think there is room for Daemon to be a little more creative. And the fact that all his body motions are boiled down to he's leaning against walls, he's coiled like this snake as opposed to a dragon, he's always giving you the illusion that you have more power than him. That's something that you're going to see out of like a talented high school performer in a fucking musical. That the villain, this sneaky villain, is kind of in the shadows not so much and isn't posturing on the others. His body language isn't particularly involved. His dialogue scenes, there's nothing that's going to stick out and make you say, well, that's terrible acting. But against these other actors, the dialogue quality is not significantly worse for Daemon and Larys. The dialogue quality is mostly the same. And so I do think there is some variation with that acting where I'm just not very impressed. I think that these performances are quite typical. Those were my only consistent acting gripes. I have some minor nitpicks, but nothing important. Dialogue-wise, it's a little more generic than you would like it to be, but still strong. This is unfair because of how poetic the early Game of Thrones exchanges were, that they were closer to Shakespearean exchanges than anything you would see in 21st century television. When you were just listening to it, not even paying attention to the detail, there's still this beautiful musicality to a lot of the back and forth that goes on. And when you do go into the detail, so much rich detail in every single line and how characters say certain words, it's just amazing. And for House of the Dragon to follow that up is so unfair on this show, but at the same time, it's something you can't escape, where it is simply not as richly packed with detail as its predecessor. But the bigger problem here is the instances of modernization. You can really tell in cases where characters are cursing, where they're trying to make these witty remarks back at characters, where it feels like the show is conforming to the general trend of television and movies, that you have to get a joke in there somehow. You have to have this funny reply. You have to curse in some way. The moment that took me out of it was actually in the finale when Rhaenyra took off Otto's hand badge, and she says, fucking traitor. And it's like, oh, the way she said that, the way that it doesn't sound right. You hear that, it's like, that doesn't quite sound like what a Game of Thrones character would say. And it happened quite a bit throughout this first season. Where House of the Dragon really excels in its writing, though, is its structure. And what I mean by that is that in every single episode, you feel like you're getting just the right amount of screen time in every single character, just the right amount of intercutting between different scenes, different scenarios. You feel like you're getting just the right amount of progression in the plot in every single episode. It doesn't feel like it's going too fast, too slow. It feels also proper. Yes, there is a tinge of fastness that comes with all the time jumps, but even then, it always feels justified. It always feels like they're aiding the story as opposed to slowing it down and making it feel too monotonous. It's mind-boggling that the time jumps were as natural as possible. You had these actresses settle into their roles so much, and you had this show finally finding its footing around episode 4. And 5 was less so, but you could still see the potential for what a great story they had going there, which feels a lot different than the one we have now. The one beforehand, in episode 4, which is my favorite episode of the series so far, is not representative of the greatness the show achieved later on, or the greatness it's going to achieve later. It's an episode, the only one in the season really, that talks about how Game of Thrones emphasizes that sex is a means of power, that it's used to manipulate people, but beyond that, it also is this deeper, darker Arthurian tale, where you just have this girl in a castle who doesn't want to be queen, and yet is forced, that responsibility is forced on her, but she wants to have fun, she wants to experience something with the common people, she wants to have a life and not the responsibilities. It's eerily similar to a Disney tale in that regard. You can definitely see that plot there, just, without all the incest and such. And it was fascinating, but it's totally different from what happens in episodes 7 through 10. Once Aemon loses his eye, House of the Dragon becomes an immeasurably better show with much higher stakes. It's become so much more exciting because you have these two factions, one where it's so easy to root for them, such strong characterization on the hero side, and such strong characterization on the villain side in the form of the Hightowers. And it's just so easy to give yourself over to that narrative. It feels so easy because Rhaenyra was so clearly cheated that you can't help but root for her. This isn't the case in the original Game of Thrones where you could back someone's claim for multiple different reasons. It was much less clear who was the real heir to the throne once Robert gets taken off, because you have Stannis, but he's with Melisandre, that doesn't seem quite right. There were a lot of moving pieces here, and it was the War of the Five Kings, so it wasn't a 1v1 battle here. It was multiple people whose actions, whose victories and losses in battle, their consequences would reverberate across the realm and potentially affect their family members in a negative way, even if they won. It gave Game of Thrones this very complicated dynamic, and while we are losing some of that here, I don't think it's all necessarily a bad thing, because I must say, I think I feel more effusively about Rhaenyra's claim than I have about any person getting on the Iron Throne in the original Game of Thrones series. And that's why House of the Dragon has the potential to be so special in Seasons 2, in Seasons 3, and Season 4, because the groundwork was here. The show looks phenomenal, the dialogue is strong, even in spite of its modernization faults, the characters most prominently featured are written exceptionally well, there are others that can rise up to their ranks, it's just that you actually had to get to the meat of the story. That was the biggest problem with House of the Dragon Season 1, is that it took time for it to really find its groove, but by episode 7, there was, kernels of greatness in the early episodes, with episode 4 being consistent, but there was no maintained consistency. Once you get to episode 7, it maintains a really strong rhythm all the way to the end. Now with season 2, you're not going to have just excellent politicking anymore, but you're also going to have moments of spectacle that feel all the more earned because we didn't get a lot of excitement in season 1 in that regard. It feels like a direct response to season 8 of Game of Thrones, that's not just throwing dragons in your face. We know that that was a huge problem with Thrones 7 and 8, that people really didn't like, that they forgot the intelligence of Game of Thrones, why people liked it in the first place. This feels like a direct response to that, because we really didn't have any epic conflict, but once we do get it, it's sure to be more earned and be all the more cathartic because we waited so long for it. I really liked House of the Dragon Season 1, and yes, there are shows that do action, that do battles, there are shows that do politics, that do struggles for power, but there's no show that quite combines them in the way that Game of Thrones shows do, that has so much moral complexity going on for it that just, it's just my niche. Like, ever since I found Game of Thrones earlier this year, it's just a piece of entertainment to me that just fits to what I like. It is this, epic storytelling set in a fantasy world that I originally liked in Star Wars, just on a much more mature level. And that's why this show is, again, an 8.6 for me today. It was an awesome first season. Can't wait to see more. And it's my third favorite show of the year so far. We'll see you next time.